This is Matt Marino, and you're listening to the Reformed Classicalist podcast, where classical Christian theology, philosophy, and ethics are being retrieved for a new reformation. If you like what you hear, check out the website at thereformedclassicalist.com and go to the YouTube channel to share, like, and subscribe. Also, make sure to review this podcast and leave 5 stars on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever you listen to your podcast on. And thanks for listening. Okay, so as you can see there, I made up a word, and I made this up a little bit, 6 years ago. I thought at first I was going to call it ratio. It didn't work. And then I realized what was happening there is just a fear of demonstrations. It's a weird, I'm not being funny, it's a psychological disorder or anything like that. I just noticed something in all the literature I was reading as I was starting to collect the newer contemporary literature on the subject of natural theology, retrieving it, and so forth. And the subtitle, let me get it back up there, of that is, if I can be puritanical about it again, or the so-called dogmatic use of natural theological demonstrations as distinguished from such demonstrations as foundational to Christian theology. In other words, there's some people who don't mind there being demonstrative natural theology. In other words, it's not just innate, it's not just in there and we move on from there to Scripture. All it does is convict us anyway. That's sort of the Bardian view. To be charitable, it's actually, Bardian view can be worse than that. At its worst, it's the Vantillian view, although they'll have a sort of a transcendental form of argument, so on, as well as a redeemed natural theology. They'll make that distinction too, as Bavinck himself did, no problem. So they'll have no problem with demonstrations of some kind in apologetics. And then they won't even mind, and this is what I meant by a dogmatic use. You started to see that more and more and more. You saw it starting, I don't know if he was the one that originated, but Richard Muller wrote an academic article in the 90s talking about Thomas Aquinas and the dogmatic use of these demonstrations. And Guy Richard and Jay Fesco followed suit in an article that they wrote, sort of following in his footsteps, and then it shows up, of course, in Muller's larger 4-volume Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, as well as J.V. Fesco Reforming Apologetics some years later, 2019, and I just kept seeing it more and more. In other places, I started to see, well, it's cool as a preamble to faith, preambula fide, even in the Roman Catholic tradition. Think of Ralph McInerney, he wrote a good book on it, others. They have no problem with that. They have no problem about the relationship between philosophy and theology, even in the midst of theology. But what they all agree, and I don't even want to say what they all agree you can't do. It's almost unspoken. It's just sort of a clause. It's a naughty thing. You did a demonstration in the middle. You went from apologetics to dogmatics. In other words, you made natural theology part of your prolegomena, and in doing so, you made reason and nature foundational. And I'm all like, so? When you think about the foundation and it being rational, what do you use to think about it? Your toes? And at this point, you think, oh, come on, Matt. These are big boys. They know what they're talking about. Yeah, they're smart. And they've given us a lot of good work. Confirmation after confirmation, as I've read more about the subject, that this is never really defended. And I'm going to argue because it can't be. In fact, the opposite of this is really what my dissertation is all about. So what's this all about? Well, Reformed Theological Retrieval has, on the one hand, out of one side of its brain, it's wanted to reaffirm the legitimacy of natural theology in apologetics and in dogmatics. You can use it as part of your Doctrine of God, or even other sections, but most obviously your Doctrine of God. But this retrieval work, by and large, has maintained a hard division between the demonstrations of the former, apologetics, and the demonstrations of the latter. Because we don't want the demonstrations of apologetics, natural theology, to be normative for the latter. In other words, to be kind of like a checkpoint, a rationalistic checkpoint, that you can't get on with the project of doing Christian theology unless you've satisfied some demands of the skeptic. And I'm like, when I do natural theological arguments, I've never once taken out a notebook and asked the skeptic what he thought a good argument would be. When I hear authors doing that, and it's almost universal in our day, it wasn't so much back in the day. It's just amazing that the fideism dies hard. The idea, one way to state the danger is this, and I'll have graphs that talk about this in just a second. But here's one way to talk about it. You will have the emergence of what is called another principium, a third, competing with what is called the Principia Ascendi, and that is God, of being. He's the first principle of being. So in other words, where do I start in terms of what is? That's God. But I could also ask the question, where do I start in terms of how do I know? And that's the Principium Cognoscendi, and that's the sort of the rational, the knowing first principle. And that's how you get into, confusing the order of being with the order of knowing. Well, theology and theological method holds those two out as two different ways of answering the question, where do you start? But if I have demonstrations of natural theology that are pre-dogmatic, that's fine as apologetics out there, but if I bring those in and start demonstrating from the existence of God to other aspects about his essence, then I'm sort of, natural theology is kind of bleeding into my prolegomena, it's bleeding into my theological method, it's bleeding into the foundation, and I'm going to have another system, which is a foundation for the Christian system. I'm going to have something autonomous. Different authors will say it in different ways. So what on earth is going on here with this Demonstrataphobia? Well, let's look at the basic meaning of this idea, because they could mean to, I'm going to be not only charitable, but I'm going to assume the best about the best authors. Authors like Richard Muller and J.V. Fesco. And I'm going to assume the best about them and say that they're probably going to mean it in this way on the left. And I just invented some terms. Not hard, I just had to add an adjective, soft and hard. There's a soft dogmatic. So in other words, you could mean this, a soft dogmatic use, which is neutral to whether or not the conclusions of apologetic natural theology form your premises or your antecedents for more attributes of God in dogmatics. So you see that? So you can mean, so for example, Thomas Aquinas, Stephen Charnock, just to give two examples, they operated as believing Christian theists. They were either, when they were doing this, they were either building the faith of those who were already so committed as believers, or they were showing the folly of unbelief. It's just another way to build up their faith, just negatively. Or maybe they were even drawing forth subsequent divine attributes. And that, as we're going to see from Muller's quote in a second, that in and of itself is not bad. But from what? In other words, in this soft use, they were not using rational demonstrations as a checkpoint that you need to pass before believing the rest of Christian truth. Now, if this is what you mean, well, then it's perfectly compatible with my thesis, with natural theology operating in the rest of theology by forming antecedents for other doctrines, most obviously the doctrine of God. But, on the other hand, you could have this hard dogmatic use. By the way, notice in the picture on the right, picture on the left, the arrow goes through a dotted line. It's permeable, and it's okay. Now, there's still questions there that I want to ask those people. But for sure, on the right, you have a hard line and an X. In apologetics, demonstrations might be useful, but only of a God already known. So there, it's sort of planting but it's allowing, it's allowing that they could be useful for something. but you already have the natural knowledge of God, innate and so forth, and yada yada. But in dogmatics, demonstrations are supplemental to knowledge within biblical language. So you have an idea of God, or you have scriptural language especially. And so when the Reformed scholastics were using natural theology, it was within their doctrine of God, and it was only with the biblically defined attributes. Okay? That would be a hard dogmatic, or a hard way to say or use the term dogmatic use. Okay? And I have to say about that second one especially, what's the real difference between that dogmatic use and Van Tillianism? That's one question we're going to want to ask right away. Now, about Richard Muller, and this is in his volume 3, not 1 on method and prolegomena, but in the 3rd volume. I thought I got rid of all those red. I keep doing that on all my videos. They spell check me. They don't know what they're talking. They spell check Muller in this case. But anyway, Muller's saying basically the Reformed Orthodox argued essence from the idea of God already possessed. So they were, even when they had natural theological type arguments, in this case he's going to talk about the ways in which Anselm's ontological argument was sort of appropriated by different Reformed scholastics, but Muller is careful to say, look at this. They only do it within their doctrine of God and from biblically controlled language, etc., or an idea of God already possessed. So anyway, here's how he says it. Here, the balance of rational argumentation with biblical material remains evident in the late Orthodox doctrine of the attributes. I said that wrong. I stressed the wrong thing. There is no obvious movement here, either into metaphysics, strictly so-called, or into natural theology. Interesting. The rational argument remains within the framework of the biblical language as understood in the exegetical tradition of the Church. This approach may be contrasted with the tendency toward a more philosophical or rationalistic doctrine of God, typical of 18th century latitudinarian works and of Wolffian orthodoxy. He's referencing Christian Wolff, sort of a direct line from rationalism to Immanuel Kant. So Kant got a lot of his conception of what rationalism was from Christian Wolff. But anyway, in the latter dogmatics, a summary statement concerning the essence and attributes of God could be elaborated as part of the Theologia Naturalis, leaving the full doctrine of God, particularly the doctrine of the Trinity, for the Theologia Supernaturalis. There's that breakdown, natural theology, supernatural theology. If you're not familiar with the grammar, it's pretty obvious what that means. But one of the things I want to keep my antennas up for, and I did as I was coining this term Demonstrataphobia, and this is all when I was reading Fesco's book in 2019 in the summer, and I was just seeing this left and right everywhere. And what I saw from Muller, Fesco, and others was, hey, here's Aquinas. Hey, Van Til, you've misread him. So in other words, so there's that historical issue. But in terms of actual method, they were still saying, well, look at the flow of the Summa. Question 1 is all about sacred scripture. Question 2 is about the existence of God. Isn't it interesting that question 1 comes before question 2? In other words, Aquinas is operating in his 5 ways within a Christian theistic understanding of God already possessed. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that as a Bible-believing Christian, Thomas Aquinas expected nature to speak this way because Romans 1:20 said so, Psalm 19 said so? If that's what you mean, okay, I can agree with that. Do you mean that his first premise was not actually a posteriori, something in the world that everybody can see, like all things are in motion? Because if you mean to reject what's obviously there on the page, I can't follow you there. And I think what was happening is one of two things. They were either trying to make Thomas palatable to Van Tillians, which I doubt, because is that really likely? Or what's more likely is the Van Tillian residue, and really the whole post-Kantian residue, has not really been cleansed from even the retrievalists, as their argument 9 times out of 10 is really restricted to the historiography. that Van Til or others have misread Thomas. They misread or haven't read the Reformed scholastic tradition, except maybe a little Puritan here, a little Puritans there. But beyond that, they're not familiar with how much blah, blah, blah. And that's where it stops. But in terms of actually analyzing the arguments and appropriating this to theological method, we are just scratching the surface. And it seems to me that there is a really unjustifiable fear of reason operating at the foundation, and it is specifically pegged. The authors will tell you if you're a careful reader. It is specifically laid at the feet of the great danger of some competing third principia. And or if you're a Van Tilian, you would say of an autonomous natural or rationalistic system, or something to that effect. Okay, let's talk a little bit more grammar to catch anybody up that needs to be caught up. There was another author during this retrieval period who really only wrote a couple things here, a book called The Reformed Objection to Natural Theology and an academic essay by the same title. He's been interacted with by the likes of James Anderson and Scott Oliphant, so the two sort of leading torchbearers of the Van Tilian tradition have interacted with him on this. And so you don't really know where Sudduth is coming from. He's being very scholarly. But at any rate, what he does some things that I like, he does some things that I don't like. And this distinction is helpful that he makes, just to put some grammar out there, put some handles on it. But then the way it's restricted and how he reads others and what he allows and what doesn't and so forth, then it becomes unhelpful. But what he does is he makes a distinction between what he calls natural theology A, natural theology B, or alpha and beta. Okay, he uses the Greek letters. But let's just call them A and B. What does he mean? Well, natural theology A that belongs to the innate. It's what you have with the package. It's immediate. And it's like an awareness of God. But it's not these demonstrations, or as Maritain called it, maybe others have used this expression too, pre-philosophical. In other words, it's that knowledge of God that everybody has, even if they don't structure it in arguments, even if they've never heard of any arguments. They would still be without excuse, to use Paul's language. Okay, that's a thing. Well, that's good. B is further knowledge. Now, here's the thing. It could mean a project natural theology. So just argumentation. The way I wrote it here is the way I'd prefer to write it. Further knowledge, illuminate. In other words, it's still natural knowledge of God. No, it's philosophy. It's man getting his dirty fingerprints all over it. Oh my goodness. And you don't think the fingerprints of our whatever this is stamped on in our soul is dirty? I thought you were a Calvinist. We're totally depraved, right? No, just our arguments. Okay, right. Okay, so Sudduth says this. 3 closely related uses. What does he mean by B? Well, he means, number 1, confirming and explicating the natural knowledge of God as a biblical datum. So in other words, finding places in Scripture, noticing in Scripture that this is actually taught. Second, assisting the systematic development of a biblically based doctrine of God. And that's kind of what Muller was saying too. You can even use natural theological reasoning in your doctrine of God. That's fine, so long as it's within your doctrine of God. And you're thinking, you're scratching your chin at this point. Well, yeah, if it's in your doctrine of God, then it's in your doctrine of God. Well, they mean more than that. The antecedents. You must be careful that the antecedents do not come from natural theological demonstrations first. That would be laying the foundation outside the Christian scripture. That would be resting Christian theism, or biblically defined Christian theism, on a general, basic, natural theism, or pagan natural theology versus true natural theology. Wrong dichotomy. It should be true or false, whether the pagan says it or the Christian. There should only be true versus false. You start to move very subtly, I'd say not so subtly, to what's called the double truth theory when you do that. Anyway, Third thing that it could be used for, legitimately, is strengthening and strengthening and augmenting the Christian's knowledge of God. Not completely sure how to see 3 is different than 2, except for maybe it's more pastoral or explaining for others, drawing it out, as opposed to actually sketching out a system of theology. That could be also circling back to apologetics at some level. But anyway, point is, the people who are saying this, they're not against natural theology. And in many cases, they're the retrievalists that are recovering it, and they have a positive view toward it. But they're almost saying, natural theology and apologetics, check, good. Natural theology and dogmatics, check, good. But making the movement from apologetics to dogmatics, and having it in your prolegomena, that makes it foundational. And again, I have to say, so it's just spoken as if we're all supposed to say, I don't want that. Well, I don't have that feeling. Anyway, Muller continues. Now he's going to do some analysis. He's going to give us examples from that period. For an early writer like Trulcatius, the divine unity arose conceptually from the basic consideration of the divine essence. In other words, from the very idea of God, he deduced, well, then God must be one also. That's what Muller's saying there. Similarly, for Turretin and Pictet, unity was the primary concept derived, on the one hand, from Scripture, and on the other, from the concept of God. You see that? Dual sources. But notice that the dual sources here, at least the way Muller explains it, are not Scripture and nature. Never mind that your mind is created and has a nature, but let's ignore that. On the one hand, from Scripture, and on the other hand, from the concept of God. Both, therefore, placed it immediately after their statements on the existence of God. Maastricht treats unity as one of the attributes which follows naturally from the spirituality, simplicity, and the immutability of God. Indeed, as a necessary conclusion from his discussion of the divine essence. I have all sorts of questions. What is this naturalness? This logical implication? Did you learn that from that logic textbook that's in Scripture? Or when he says necessary conclusion. So even the relationships between them. You say, I know what you're saying, and we're not against the use of logic in theologizing. Sure, but are those objects of the mind antecedent to Scripture? Right? So, I'll answer some objections to that later. Antecedent, so I have to learn that before I learn. No, it's not about chronology in your mind. It's about ontologically whether the thing is the case. For example, whether Scripture was ever written or not. Whether God ever decided to communicate His word but created a world. Would those things be ontologically the case? Well, then that's part of the created things that Paul talks about in Romans 1:20. Now, maybe I'm moving a little too fast. But I assume that if you got this far in this episode, you're into this sort of thing anyway. And there's others who have talked about this. Sebastian Raymond, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He wrote a book called Divine Discourse, mostly about Owen and his, but he mentioned some other writers like Junius and Turretin and Witsius and others. And he chronicles arguments made by Maastricht and Owen for the very possibility of theology. And these include the consent of the nations for God's existence. That was one of the older arguments, not so much used anymore. The immortality of the soul, reason itself, common notions, and the desire to know these highest truths by reason. These each amount to natural theological arguments. And so, Raymond concludes, in this limited sense, natural theology provides, according to Owen, Turretin, and Witsius, the basis for supernatural theology. And people say that, and they say it with great hesitation, and you can almost see them wincing through their ink on the page. Others, much more refreshingly, totally embrace it. For example, Wallace Marshall writes a book called Puritanism and Natural Theology, and he chronicles Puritan after Puritan, Richard Baxter, Edward Lay, Charnock, you name it, in books that you can find, a use of the term foundational. That these arguments, in Baxter's case he'll use the word evidence a lot, are foundational to the Christian theistic understanding of God, the whole doctrine of God. And therefore, since the doctrine of God is so foundational to the rest of your system of theology, foundational to everything else. The Puritans, Marshall chronicles very convincingly, spoke freely in that way. They had no problem with it. They didn't seem to think that, therefore, reason and nature would be competing with God and Scripture as some kind of a third ultimate authority. Okay, let's pictorially demonstrate some of the problem here, or the perceived problem. It's not a problem. Here's the Reformed Orthodox view, very simply depicted in a house analogy. You see that the Principium Ascendi, that's your foundation to the house. The Principium Cognoscendi, I just used a magnifying glass, why not? It's your way of seeing everything in the house for what it is. So you can see how those function in relation to the house of Christian doctrine, which of course symbolizes your whole systematic theology, all of your loci and systematic theology, and even your interpretation of Scripture. Really, the whole theological enterprise. This is the way those two principia that the Reformed Orthodox would have viewed things in. Well, here's the unwarranted fear. Here is Demonstrataphobia in a nutshell. You see nature and reason now either arguing to Scripture in some evidential apologetics, but really the one I want to focus on is the line that goes around Scripture to a conception of God, which is now going to be a new foundation once things get rolling here. Now, as there are examples of this that you can show from Reformed history, Muller does, and others would chronicle this, that at the end of Reformed Orthodoxy, you had a pull toward rationalism. The son of Francis Turretin, Jean-Alphonse Turretin, he writes a book on natural theology. It's published in Geneva in the 1740s. And the idea seems to be that he proposed, as Michael Sudduth wrote, he proposed natural theology as a system of purely rational truths accessible to reason apart from any supernatural revelation. So again, you want to push back on the Demonstrataphobia and say, well, what is this going to be accessible to? Your toes? No, your reason. But the problem, though, is not so much reason as the instrument, the receptacle, the discoverer. The problem that they see as natural theology is now its own independent system and will be the primary system that the Christian system answers to. Does that help make sense there? That's really what they're pushing back against. And of course, if it did do that, that would be bad. We don't disagree with you about that. But is it really so? Must it be? Okay? Well, how are we what's the opposite of a dogmatic use? Well, if you look at this picture, it'd be a pre-dogmatic use. So how do some of these authors, let's go to Sudduth, for how you would start to think about defining a pre-dogmatic use of natural theology. What would really be happening? Well, he rightly says that the inclusion of theistic demonstrations in the dogmatic works of the medieval scholastics and the Reformed scholastics, he says, was not an attempt to make natural theology a rational, pre-dogmatic foundation for revealed theology. You know, I still don't like putting those together, rational, pre-dogmatic, natural, as if they all have to collapse and mean the same thing. The perception is based on a faulty assumption that conflates the place of natural theology in the early Reformed dogmatics and its role in post-Enlightenment theological systems developed by Reformed thinkers under the influence of Cartesianism and Wolffian rationalism. You know, just put that all in a big box, stretching from René Descartes in the 1630s and 40s all the way into the 18th century. Was that temptation there? Yes. Was that result there? Yes. You have to, the deistic writers. There's a rationalist and sometimes an empiricist principle that sort of eats up everything else. Is that a thing? Sure it's a thing. But is it necessarily the case? Or in other words, what's the culprit? Maybe is a better question to ask. Well, Let's bring our house back. Because Sutter speaks on the dangers of this pre-dogmatic natural theology. And he speaks for a lot of people.
Someone stole my post by
In summarizing the
swapping.
period of late Reformed orthodoxy, he says, consequently, natural theology acquired the status of a prolegomenon to revealed theology. Now, prolegomena, if you're not familiar, is that first section in a theology text, if it's a big systematic theology, that basically charts your course. It answers questions like, what is theology? What are we even doing here? Is it a science? Is it a wisdom? Is it practical? Is it, or is it theoretical? Is it this? Is that? How do you approach it? What comes first? Does the order matter? You know, the kind of things, the questions you're going to want to ask. And if natural theology is there, then you're sort of proving God's existence as a precondition. That's what he means by it functioning as a prolegomena to revealed theology. It's a checkpoint. A purely rational discourse, Sutter says, on the divine existence and attributes separated from Scripture, laid a foundation for revealed theology. Well, that would be bad. And there again, you see that very... Now, did I skip a slide? Sure I did. Okay, so we'll get back to that house. Really, what does this mean? What would it mean for a natural theology to be a prolegomena to revealed theology? What would be so bad? What would happen? Well, a bit further down, Sutter uses the expression pre-dogmatic, and things become clear. He says, this pre-dogmatic function of natural theology stands in sharp contrast to the way theistic arguments were utilized in 16th and many 17th century dogmatic systems. Okay, so he really is blaming something that happens in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, and so on. Maybe this will help us. Maybe it gets more clarity. It doesn't fully, in my mind. He notes that it was acceptable to include natural theology under a prolegomena, since that at least placed it under Scripture. The trouble is that if natural theology is the foundation of the whole, then the tendency would be for it to develop into what he says, into an autonomous system of rational theology prefaced to dogmatic theology. And if you're familiar with Reformed epistemology, this is just another commonality between Plantinga and those guys, and Van Tillians and Bardians. There's just this sort of common thread of complaining of things at the foundation that sort of determine whether or not you have been rational. And so any Christian that hasn't thought about this or argued through it is somehow guilty of having flouted their epistemic duties. That's the way one of these RE people would say it. And scholars, they can't track with this for the pinheads. They see what's different about Bardians and Van Tillians and Reformed epistemology. They say, no, well, they're not arguing the same as that. Yes, on the surface, but there's a common thread about the subject matter that we're actually talking about here. Okay? So I want to get more specific. Why? Because I'm annoying. That's what I do. I can't leave well enough to, for me, this never passed the sniff test. And so, despite all the huffing and puffing of those who have inherited the Van Tillian royal tailoring business, they don't want to admit that the emperor has no clothes. I say it doesn't pass the sniff test. It's stronger than that. I know exactly what they're saying. I know exactly after I hear it the second, the third, the fourth time. Okay, I see the fear. I have to zoom in further. It's just what I do. It's how my brain has worked. I get the microscope out and I say, they're totally saying this. Why can't anybody see it? And so I'm doing the dissertation that I'm doing. And there's a lot of other causes of their arriving at this point. This is not meant to be comprehensive. This is just explaining what this pre-dogmatic use is versus a dogmatic use. And it's driven by this demonstrataphobia or foundationalisticaphobia, but that doesn't sound as fun, so I don't say that. At what exact point? Let's go for some criteria here. Let's get specific. Let's make them define their terms, because I would argue they haven't justified it anywhere. It's just assumed. So I would want to ask any of these authors, at exactly what point is inclusion of natural theology in your method, in your prolegomena? At what point does that become a rationalistic, pre-dogmatic foundation or an autonomous, natural theological competing system? At what point? What's happening that commits that blunder? Well, Sudduth speaks to an answer, but I would say it suffers from the same lack of clarity as Van Til on the extreme, but even Bavinck had some. They would speak about taking your stand in Scripture, as opposed to other systems and a synthetic system versus a. And it's like, what do you mean by that? And they have an answer, but it just, again, it doesn't pass the sniff test. And so Sudduth, on this pre-dogmatic use, I'll come back to him. He gets us closer. It entails a more positive use. Positive use, so good, right? Well, no, what he means is it's filling in the knowledge of God from nature. It entails a more positive use of theistic arguments to establish, and I purposely put that in bold and italics, to establish the faith. You see that? To lay a foundation down. By the way, what would happen to a house if it didn't have a foundation? Quicksand, right? Boom. And so this will do it. The Bible won't do it. God himself won't do it. This natural, rational picture of God has to be the foundation. Now, he didn't say all that, but that's what it means. Here, reason has become a principium of the dogmatic system. See, that's what he means. Reason is competing where God and Scripture should have been. Consequently, reason plays a substantive and formative role in the dogmatic system. Sure does, and it should. And so should the natural knowledge of God. Including the subtle implication that faith, or at least the reasonableness of this, see the checkpoint, fear? The reasonableness of faith rests on the prior establishment by reason of Christian doctrine. See, man makes himself a law, autonomous, makes himself a law by these pieces of knowledge that inform my doctrine of God. If I bring that in the house, if that comes first, then I have an authority over Scripture, and it happens to be my reason, or just reason, the reason of man, whatever you want to call it. No, not in the least. Let's do a concluding experiment, just to put a little bit more cement on this idea, and hopefully it'll just drive home the point a little bit. One of the things I want to do, as my dissertation is coming to a close, is in the final chapter, I'm going to give examples of all your favorite theologians doing exactly this. They ignored all this stuff. They wouldn't have thought, if they would have heard modern theologians talking like this, they would have said, what are you talking about? This is normal. And you do it too. You're just virtue signaling to all your fideistic friends. So I asked the question, well, what would be so wrong? And by the way, I don't just do this with a client. If you're Reformed right now and say, oh, he's doing a Thomism. Okay, in my last chapter, I'm going to show you Charnock doing it about 100 times. Maastricht. All your favorite, in fact, the small theology books, even an A.W. Pink, in the Attributes of God or anywhere else. This is how theologians talk. They assume natural knowledge of God, and they build those as their premises to inform their doctrine of God. Doing so doesn't make Scripture, doesn't mean you can't correct it with Scripture. Oh no, this came first, now it's untouchable. Who told you that? So I've got these three categories. I'm moving from left to right. Remember, the picture on the right at the beginning is a big no-no, big thick line in between those. Here I'm adding that category all the way on the left, which is that first natural knowledge of God that is innate or at principle level, or however you want to structure that out. That's the pre-philosophical kind of natural knowledge of God. I don't see an argument. I haven't made an argument yet. I just have an impression in looking at nature, looking in the mind, looking at my mortality, whatever it is. And I've got 5 examples. A equals A, so logic. Every effect has a cause. It's a formal principle. There's a right and a wrong. How does Lewis start in Mere Christianity? All things are in motion. There's Thomas's first way. And that's the example I'm going to build off of. Everything moves toward an end. Whether you're, an intelligent design, there's design. You could reframe it in different ways. These are just sort of those impressions. My awareness, that kind of natural knowledge of God. I move over to the right, and I use discursive reasoning. I move from some of these principles to form premises and then to conclusions. My example is Thomas's first way. I'll just shorthand it. All things moving are moved by another. That's after all things are in motion. That's my observation. That's my real first premise. I'm just kind of shorthanding it. Well, nothing is set in motion. In order to be set in motion, it has to be potential, not in act. But nothing that is potential can be set in motion but by something in act. And so by another, and so by another, and so by another. But this process can't go to infinity. There has to be a first that is put in motion by no other. And this we call God. Now that's his first argument of the five. But in the process, he shows that there must be some mover who is not himself moved. In other words, who has no potentiality whatsoever. He must be simply in act. And we call that actus purus. Well, lo and behold, one chapter later, his first divine attribute he's unpacking is the simplicity of God. Guess what he does? He says, as has already been proved. What? What has already been proved? Well, it's already been proved that the first being in no way can have any potentiality. He must be in pure act. Well, if that's true, every body is in potentiality. Well, then he can't have a body. But not just that. Composition. That's a division of existence from essence. So if you're composed of parts, then you have these attributes which can be removed, can be divided. They are organized. Well, maybe they've already been organized, and maybe they've always been organized, but in order to have organization, there has to be an organizer. What composes is prior to the composed. In other words, prior to the essence. Something had to exist before an essence that is composed. Now, I'm borrowing from his first article through 4, and then again his 7th article in that third question. But his conclusion is that God is simple. It's one of the ways he gets there, is by reaching back into his... Matt, what are you doing? I'm lost. He, in his doctrine of God, reached back pre-dogmatic. He reached back to his natural theology and said, wait a minute, if that's true, then this must also be true of God. Who else does that? Charnock, Maastricht, Turretin, Calvin, even when he talks about a minimalistic infinity and spirituality in the Institutes. Everybody talks like this all the time. And then in the 20th century, a bunch of schools came around and said, oh, we can't do that. Well, why can't you do that? Well, it have this result and that result, and it would have this implication. No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't. That is simply not true. So my dissertation is very simple. It's called God, Reason, and Nature. And it's building up, and it's the subtitle I'm still kind of working on, but the idea is to make the case for natural theological antecedents and their role everywhere in theology, most obviously in the doctrine of God, but also in things like law, your doctrine of man and creation, and so on and so forth. It has only 4 chapters. There's an exegetical chapter, easy peasy. You're just going into Romans 1 and all the classic verses. You got to do some work dealing with the commentaries. Not everybody agrees, but you make that case first. And there's a historical section just showing, hey, before the modern era, this is how theologians talked from every tradition. They talked about reason and nature as one unified field in which God has spoken. And they didn't segment philosophy and theology. Now, their different methods did crystallize, became distinct as time went on, but they didn't separate all these things into these walls and say, no, you can't do that, no, you can't say that, you can't do that, and they just did it. And they were right. The modern theologians are wrong. Third, a philosophical chapter where I have to revisit realism, because I'm going to argue that universals are what you have when you have conclusions to natural theological arguments. Those universals then structure all the particulars of systematic theology. That gets fun, but it's hard to accept because then you have to have a right view of this, and you have to be a realist, and and then it just gets suffocating because you just, because rightness matters, and I don't know, people have different hang-ups. And then finally I get to systematic. I draw out all the examples of all your favorite Reformed authors doing exactly what Thomas did and what I just showed you. So it's time to be healed from your Demonstrataphobia, if you have it. Not everybody does. Some people will come right up to this for the first time and say, yeah, I like that even. And yeah, I do recognize Charnock saying that. And yeah, it kind of seems like what Paul was doing on Mars Hill. So you have a biblical stamp of approval on it. Oh, I can go on and on about this, but I won't. In the coming months, I'll probably sort of randomly, whenever I have time, just give bits and pieces, little parts of the dissertation that I think are important. But that one I think is very important when you run into that idea of a dogmatic use versus a pre-dogmatic use of natural theology.